Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow this program, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you may be watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And as you know, this week I've been talking about issues around death and funerals, which I think is a very important issue for our community to have a look at. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about ideas of the afterlife from a Corellian point of view, and not a particularly uncommon point of view. I certainly would never say a universal point of view, because I don't know if there is a universal point of view, but we'll be talking from my point of view. And this will be basically wrapping up this subject for us this week. Tomorrow I'll be moving on to another subject that we will mention a little later in the program. And then next week, I was planning to talk again about the Corellian ancestors. So when we talk about afterlife, that's been a subject that's come up repeatedly in discussing death in general and funerals. And, there are very different points of view on how the deceased views the rites of death, depending on the background that the person is coming from. A lot of people feel the soul couldn't possibly care less. It goes on to do whatever it's going to do. Other people, particularly from a more traditional historical background, feel that the correct performance of the rites of mourning and death is important to the soul, if only as a sign of respect. Particularly in families that venerate their ancestors, the aspect of working with the person as an ancestor is important to the soul from that point of view. So there are a number of different ways to look at this. The idea that the soul has no further interest in what's happening in this life, and hello to Tom in the chat room. Good to see you, Tom. Hello to Renee in the chat room. But the idea that the soul has no further interest in this life is largely an advent of Christian theology. If you look at most traditional Western and other pagan religions historically, they did regard the soul as continuing to have, at least in many cases, an important aspect in the life of the living that they've left behind in the form of an ancestor, whether they're using that term or not. We see this very strongly in Egypt, where people were regularly interacting with what they considered to be their ancestors. We see it to a lesser degree, but still present in Greece. We see it again to a greater degree in Rome, which was very big on ancestor veneration. And generally the ancestors had a household altar or were part of a household altar. In some of these places, if they were wealthy families, the ancestors might have their own little temple attached to their tomb. And rites would be performed there on a more or less daily basis. In fact, ideally, in Egypt at least, it was a daily basis. And in Egypt, it was not uncommon to also make a bequest to a local temple to have statues of the given ancestors in the temple, sharing the offerings that were made to the temple deities. And hello to Zayla from Dublin. And it's good to see you, Zayla. So we see a lot of veneration of the ancestors in these ancient cultures, and the idea that they were still involved in what was happening here. Now, and hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kazan. I wanted to talk today about the afterlife itself, and this is the first part. Do those who go on into the afterlife still have an interest in we the living? Do they remain involved in this world? And I think in the contemporary world, this is an individual question. And I think actually even in these ancient cultures that we're talking about, it was still something of an individual question, because you will notice not all of the ancestors got equal treatment. It depended on the length of their lives, what they did, who they were. And although you'll see things that give the impression that people believed that the ancestors required these things to happen to continue to exist, you also see things that suggest that they believe they continued to exist either way. Egypt is especially misleading in this regard, partly because of 19th century assumptions based on Egyptian practices. One of the things we all are very much aware of, I think, in the modern world of the History Channel and so forth, is the idea of Egyptian grave goods, and that they buried these huge amounts of wealth with their dead when they were able to, that were left there forever. But in fact, if you look at it, many Egyptian tombs that are known, they not uncommonly went back and circulated some items back out, put new items in. It wasn't as concrete as all that, and they seem to have believed, if you look at the things they wrote and the things they drew, that these things took on an astral reality, regardless of the physical objects. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. So my attitude is that it really kind of depends on the attitude of the person, what the attitude of their spirit will be. And hello to Janet in the chat room. Someone like myself who spent his lifetime working with the ancestors, of course I'm going to remain interested in what happens in this world. Someone who doesn't have that background may not look back for a second. And I don't know that that's really different than how it's ever been. I think there's always been a lot of dependence on the personal development of the person when they cross over, the extent to which they're going to be active, even in cultures that venerate their ancestors. Some things about the idea of death. We talked a little bit yesterday about some of the practices around death. We didn't get terribly far into it, but some of the things that are generally said is that for a lot of people, when they die, it is a matter of surprise to them. I mean, and that is not anything that should be surprising to us, because most death is unexpected, has little warning. And it's not uncommon, according to those who have had near-death experiences, or who have brought experiences back through regression, not uncommon that at first they don't know what's happened. They don't immediately know that they're dead. This is one of the reasons why the rites of death can be important, to help them to know what's happened. Sometimes they don't know who they were at first. It comes back to them slowly. And it usually takes them a little while to cross over. Crossing over has been represented in many different ways historically. Going into the light is the predominant image of the modern Western world, but it's also been shown as crossing a river, going into a forest. There have been different ways to look at how we cross over. But when the spirit does, it's generally agreed that it's met by those who it has known earlier in life, who are waiting for it, and moves forward with them. And sometimes they will see those spirits even before they cross over. Sometimes it's once they've crossed over. If it takes them a while to cross over, their spirit guides will be trying to help them. But they don't always hear. It depends on the person. We were talking the other day about how a spirit can be caught between the worlds, or a portion of a spirit. And that portion will not be able to move on until certain things are resolved. And it's often the case that they won't necessarily be able to hear the attempts at help that their own guides and ancestors are trying to give them because of whatever is holding them in place. Which is why it can be helpful for the living to also work with helping to cross over spirits. This is the minority of cases, but it's worth mentioning. When they've crossed over, it's generally said that they encounter whatever they consider the great power of the universe, goddess, god, particular deities, and generally have a review of the life that's ended. Not being judged by the deity, but being judged by themselves. Is this what you meant to do? Do you have regrets? What would you do differently? And, one of the earliest things I remember in this life, in the way of spiritual teaching, was my grandmother's teaching that we can repeat this life if we didn't like how it worked. And I very much am a believer in that. And I think that it can be the whole life or part of the life, and we may perceive it sequentially. I think actually everything is simultaneous, but our minds will not have a way to process that. But this is basically what you do before you really enter into the afterlife. Now, once you've entered in, it's generally said that you initially perceive it as you perceive this life. There are exceptions depending on the person's psychic development and their expectations, but generally, it's what you expect it to be at first. This is why when you look at the ancient world, the afterlife usually strongly resembles this life. It's what they were expecting, it's what they knew. In some cases, they couldn't imagine anything else. A lot of people who have done, who have either had past near-death experiences or from past life regressions, see it a little differently than everyday life. Some of them talk about cities of light, talk about spirits as being beings of light. And it is important to bear in mind that when we talk about spirits in the afterlife, we're not talking about a life that's really like this one, even though at first it may appear to be. We're talking about an energetic life. We're talking about an astral life. They are energetic beings. They don't have mouths. They don't have hands as such, although, again, they can perceive it that way at first. But, when you bring through a spirit speaking, they're not speaking, they're thinking at you, and you're bringing that through. So if you get some ridiculous accent, you're the one who's likely putting it there, not them, because they have no mouth to have an accent with. Now, Raven Wolf makes an interesting point in the chat room, analogizing the afterlife to the Star Trek holodeck, and the idea that it is a reality created for you, which represents what's most comfortable for you. And that actually does, to some extent, go with what I've understood initially. Now, the longer you're there and the greater your spiritual development, the more you're going to move beyond that and see things more as they actually are. On the other hand, the lesser your development, that may be the nature of your entire afterlife experience. It may always look exactly as you first perceive it, or it may develop into something else, something more purely energetic. And I think it depends on, in part, on what you have brought with you to be able to interpret it. In the Third Degree book, I tell a famous joke, which I think is not entirely untrue. And I've been told by those who are there that there's more than one place in the afterlife, that it's like this world. Not everybody here is living the same. Not everyone is living in the same place. Not everyone is in quite the same conditions, even climatically. Um, and I think that is not exactly untrue for the afterlife as well. And the famous joke is that a pagan priestess dies and is met by her grandmother coming into the afterlife. And she gets all settled in, and the grandmother shows her around, and she takes her to um, a, um, a lovely nematon in the woods where the druids are having their afterlife, and she takes them to a um, a lovely Greek temple where the Greeks have their afterlife, and she shows them a lovely Egyptian temple where the Egyptians are having their afterlife. Um, and everywhere they go, people kind of wave at them, and everything is pretty open. And then they come to a large stone building, which is quite closed off. And the grandmother says, "Now be very quiet." And they kind of tiptoe by this building and continue their tour. And the granddaughter is confused, and she says, "Grandmother, why did we have to be quiet going by that building?" And the grandmother says, "Well, those are the Christians. They think they're the only ones there, and we don't want to upset them." Um, but I don't know that that isn't what we experience in the afterlife. If we have very strong expectations, I believe we will get them. And if we think we're the only ones who are going to be there, we're the only ones we'll notice. Doesn't mean nobody else is there. We're the ones we'll notice. Um, and I mentioned I mentioned people out of past societies. I don't know that they're necessarily um, um, all that aware of things outside of their own experience. Um, and what I found is that different groups of ancestors work together for certain things. The group of ancestors I've always worked with were very concerned with the turn of the age, very concerned with bringing in a new age, which certainly we're seeing. We're seeing the destruction of the old one. Um, I don't imagine I will live to see what replaces it, because it's going to take a while. But we're definitely seeing some major changes, as I was raised to expect. Um, but it's my understanding that when you have entered into the afterlife, there are all kinds of things you can do. I mean, there are places that are nothing but endless parties, which many ancient mythologies talk about. You have Valhalla in Norse tradition. You have the Venusberg in medieval Germanic tradition. You have many things like that are basically just big parties where people are in a state of constant celebration. But a lot of people say there are also places of great learning, and that you can go and improve your skills between lives and work with them, because many ancestors, many spirit guides work as healing guides, and they work. I mean, they're constantly in motion. So this too is something that can await us in the afterlife. Um, some of those past life regressions and some of those um, near-death experiences talk about things like institutions of learning. Now, I've been told, and I guess I won't really know with absolute certainty until I get there, but I've been told that this world is where we open new doors, so that we can work on anything in our spiritual self in the other world if the door has already been opened. If it has to be opened for the first time, it can't really be done there. And that kind of goes with my understanding of what this world is about, that it's about change and transformation and progression. But most of us have opened a lot of doors, and there are lots of things we can work on between lives. And I was speaking the other day that although I am a great believer in reincarnation, um, a portion of our personality always remains within the soul. Sometimes it goes dormant, but it can be called back when it's needed. Sometimes it does not go dormant, at least not for a really long time. Um, and I think that these are important things to consider. Um, and in the chat room, we have the statement, "This world is a staging ground. Life begins after we enter the real reality, which is death." That's certainly not what the dead have told me. Most of them have said that that this world has a very important purpose, and um, that it plays a vital role in their own development. Um, so yeah, I would not share that point of view. I do believe that both worlds and others that we may not even know of all have their important purposes. Um, but I don't think either one of them stands alone, or particularly should. I think this world exists to move forward and to transform ourselves. Now, looking back over the first 3 quarters of my life, I asked myself, did I use that time well? Did I do the transformations that I would want to achieve in this life? And my answer is, well, not all the ones that I maybe could have done, but a lot of important ones. Um, I do feel overall that I used the time relatively well. There are always going to be things you look back and say, oh, I wish I'd done that. Or I wish I'd done this other thing. Um, at least when we're looking at what we might have done. Um, but I did what I could. And I think for all of us in the end, that is our ultimate answer. Um, we use this life as best we can. I believe most of us have multiple versions of any one given life. Um, I've been told over the years that every major decision we make in life basically splits our life expression into multiple directions. One where we went one way with that decision, one where we went the other. Sometimes there are more versions. And I've occasionally seen um, aspects of some of these other versions of life. So I think that it's very much a process rather than an event. So when we talk about leaving this life and going into the afterlife, when we think of ourselves as having many probable lives, there's no reason to think they all end at once. I'm quite certain that at least one of my lives ended all the way back in 1990, if not, in fact, a couple of them. Now, V in the chat room, hello V, asks whether reincarnation is a choice and how long of a time between incarnations. Well, let me take that in reverse order. I don't think there's any one answer to how long between incarnations. I think it depends on the needs of the soul. And also, I'm not under the impression that time works the same in the afterlife that it does here. So I'm not entirely sure that there's exactly an answer to that. It's been my experience in this life that the next incarnation can overlap with the current one, and often does, and that we have multiple probabilities of each life, but also other expressions of our soul living at the same time. And that ultimately it's all kind of simultaneous. So when we talk about the time span between, although it can take a little while to work your mind around it, I don't think that it's actually certainly not a single answer, and I'm not entirely sure it's actually a thing. But is reincarnation a choice? My understanding is absolutely. My understanding has always been um, that we live um, that we definitely have a choice in our incarnation, whether we incarnate at all, how we incarnate, although we may not have choice of every detail in every way. I think we mostly have choices about exactly what we're going to get. I was always taught that our life is a contract that we enter into before we come in, and that we revise in every second we're alive. Um, but is reincarnation a choice? My answer to that is to refer back to one of my favorite movies, The Adding Machine. The Adding Machine, and I talked about this just days ago, but I'll talk about it again. It portrays the afterlife in the form of one of those large parties where everyone is doing anything they want to do. It's a giant carnival, and many of the spirits there are very happy with this, and many of them are just as frustrated and miserable as they ever were. Having everything they could possibly want has not solved their problems, because the problems are inside, not outside. Because of that, they're drawn back into this life. The saying in the movie was, "The most blessed remain." Anyone may, but only the blessed do, which means those who have worked out their problems will stay longer, but the others return to this world, and they come as a choice. But on the other hand, it's a choice, but it's also maybe an instinct, maybe a personal need to come back and continue to work on those issues. So it's a choice and a need at the same time. I don't think anyone is forced to come back. I think that instead it's impossible to stay when you need to come back. You're just going to find yourself drawn to it. Now, hello to Kim in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kim. Kim says, I show my granddaughter pictures of my family who have passed and ask if she met them before coming here. She's almost 2 and just learning to talk. She has reacted to pictures like the images were familiar to her. And yes, I'm not at all surprised by that. When children are young like that, they still often have the memories from between their lives. They have far greater psychic abilities. So I think that's a great thing to do. I would encourage any parent or grandparent on a spiritual path to consider doing that. I think it's very positive. Now, today is our last day for talking about death, at least at this moment. Tomorrow, well, next week we're going to talk about the Corellian ancestors a little bit. But tomorrow we're going to talk about the idea of whether or not there is a community curse hitting the leaders of the pagan community, including and in fact beginning with myself. This has recently been brought to public attention by one of the major leaders of the community, who I think is the first one to say it in public, but not the first one to say it. And Rev Ravenwolf says, why would there be a curse? Well, if you have to ask that, your head is in the sand. You have not paid attention to what's happening in this culture. If you have to wonder about ideas like spiritual warfare, which have been going on for years. It seems like in the last few months that there has been an unusual number of very similar events to people whose greatest similarity is merely their position in the community. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. I don't want to get too far into it today, because then we won't have anything to talk about tomorrow. But and we'll also be talking about whether it is a thing. But it is something people have been wondering about for most of this year. And it's only just now becoming a public wonder. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, for today, I want to thank you for being here. It's been a wonderful time with you, as it always is. I love all of you. I love spending this time with you. And let us close with our prayer as we normally do. The Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this world we live in. We thank you for the many tools and opportunities that it gives to us as spirits. We know that we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, but we also know that both of these are necessary to experience, necessary to move forward. We thank you for being our guide on both sides of the veil. And we hope to continue to stand together, one family hand in hand, living in spirit, as we go forward. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and with respect. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Oh, and hello to Diane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Diane. And until next time, may you be blessed.